Hi, my name is Mary Davenport. I'm a U.S. Army Nurse Corps veteran. My parents in Stephen, Minnesota are Lawrence and Phyllis Sunsdahl, brother David Sunsdahl, also veterans. And part of my tie to being an Army nurse was my mother's sister, Jeanette Thibodeau, was an Army nurse in World War II. And I grew up knowing her stories and knew I wanted to be a nurse my whole life. And so my introduction into the Army Nurse Corps was through my Aunt Jean. I happened to be spending a summer there in Minneapolis during the summer between my junior and senior years in high school, and an old Army friend of hers who was still in the reserves happened to be over also for dinner that night. I shared with them how I was going to be applying to nursing schools, and they said, well, you need to sign up for this Army nursing program that's in force right now, and you'll get the greatest education ever. And that piqued my interest. So when my senior year in high school started, with the assistance of the guidance counselor, I applied to that program. We found out what it was and how to apply.
What year was that, Mary?
Say again?
What year was that?
So 1972.
72, okay.
Fall of 71 was my senior year in high school. And so that would have been when the application was made. Sometime later, I was called for a personal interview with an Army nurse representative, and my dad drove me to Fargo, North Dakota. We met in a private residence where there was a friend of a friend type setup, and I sat in this bedroom with her and had my interview. And of course she asked me a lot of questions about myself and high school and interests, but one question stands out that sticks with me today, and she says, well, tell me how you feel about following orders. And I alluded to, well, I suppose if you're ordered to do something, you have to do it. And she came right back at me and she said, you know, that's what was wrong and happened at the My Lai massacre. You don't follow orders if you know somebody is wrong. And what I took from that was a life lesson in your moral trajectory and what you are willing to do, or maybe you learn to compromise and try and make something work, but if there's something morally that you won't do, you hold the line. And I learned that lesson early, and it made me think, and I have taken that part of that interview with me. So then I learned in April of 72 that I was accepted into the program, and graduated from high school then. And
Of course, you knew Vietnam was going on at the time.
Yes.
When you enlisted.
Yes, yes. And actually, the name of this program, acronym WRAIN, or RAIN, Walter Reed Army Institute of Nursing. And this program was associated with the University of Maryland for baccalaureate nursing degree. And we lived on post at Walter Reed in Delano Hall, and it was a huge building. All the dorm rooms were there. I had a roommate. When you got to be a senior, you got to have your own room, but regardless, I'll come back to that. But Walter Reed Army Institute of Nursing, I Googled it, and you can see a blurb about it. That ends up on the University of Maryland website. Regardless, I was sworn in August of
Fargo?
In Fargo, a week before my brother was sworn in also, because his lottery number was low and he had a deferment for draft. But we went in a week apart from each other. And I was sworn in as an E3. I went in as an E3, private first class. And
is it because
that was just part of the enticement, the enhancement to get recruits, because they needed Army nurses.
Okay.
And I received that E3 pay my 4 years of college, which allowed me to save up to buy a car. And other benefits. I was able to attend, we all in my class were able to attend the liberal arts college first 2 years anywhere in the U.S. that was accredited for transfer to University of Maryland School of Nursing program. So I was at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis for those 2 years. And then after that was out at Walter Reed Army Medical Center for my last 2 years. And this big Delano Hall dormitory that I lived in, again, had all of our dorm rooms, but it had a huge auditorium. It was just a huge building, 3 levels.
So you didn't have a basic training?
I had an officer's basic training after I graduated.
Okay.
So I did not have an enlisted
But
basic training.
you're enlisted now, and no basic training,
yes,
all schooling.
Yes. You know what? It was a really pretty plush program. And I didn't realize that until afterwards. People like you are asking me about it and realize I went in and off the bat in E3 and received this money, and all I had to do was go to school. So I know that I got in on I guess you'd call it a good deal. And then of course the war was over, the Vietnam conflict was over before I graduated from college. And in fact, the class after me was the last class, then that nursing program was shut down. But we had already been recruited and were in it, and the Army saw through my class and the class behind me, our 4 years of schooling, and then that program ended. So Walter Reed, going to school, was wonderful living in that area. I did my nursing clinicals at Walter Reed. I was also bused to Fort Meade in Laurel, Maryland. I did clinicals there. Other classmates went to Bethesda Naval Hospital. We were bused all over that area, my whole class. We started out with 168 co-eds, whatever.
So what kind of training is involved? I mean, what are you doing? Just nursing?
Nursing school.
I didn't say
nursing school.
Just nursing, but
so classroom work, class studies. There was nothing military about it in terms of how we dressed or anything. We did eat at the mess hall at Walter Reed's hospital, and first time in my life I'd eaten grits. First time in my life, what else? I'd had okra and black-eyed peas. I remember that. Also, the thing I really remember about the mess hall is how big the spoons were. You know, you had to eat fast, and I even since then I've never eaten with such a big spoon in my life. So that was kind of a memory for me. Regardless,
so
I just went to school.
When you're in there, Mary, did you know anybody? Was there anybody that?
No, but we were from all over the U.S., and there were a couple of other classmates from Minnesota. And when I drove out to Washington, D.C. for my junior year, there was another student from Red Lake Falls who was a year ahead of me. And I drove out with her for my junior year. I didn't need a car, but I needed a car for my senior year because we drove all over the DC and Baltimore area when we were, for instance, doing community health nursing. We had to do all these home visits, and I also realized that back then, all these papers we had to write, if you were lucky, the library had the book or the article you needed to do your paper, and quickly realized we would go all over the city area to libraries to find what we needed to write our papers. So I had a National Library of Medicine and an NIH card, would use their libraries. I also drove to Catholic University, used their library in College Park, Maryland. I remember making the rounds to all these places so I could write a term paper to get the information I needed. It was also, I graduated in 1976, which was the bicentennial year, and they were putting in the metro subway in Washington, D.C., and President Carter had this big push on that he wanted that subway system completed before the bicentennial celebrations. So I remember seeing that go in, basically. And the other big plus to that was the tall ships were going up and down the eastern seaboard. And they were in harbor in Baltimore, which wasn't too far away, at the time of my graduation. And were able
When you say tall ships, the
big
carriers?
sailing ships that came from Europe to commemorate the U.S.'s bicentennial.
Okay.
So I recall there were 3, I think, that we saw. And they were in different ports. It was just part of that celebration, and so it was fortuitous timing for me at that time. So I graduated from nursing school.
What's your rank now?
So when I graduated, I was still in E3 on June 5th of 1976. On June 6th, was our swearing-in ceremony as officers, and I was sworn in as a first lieutenant. So I also bypassed being a second lieutenant. It was just the incentives they put out there to get people in so they could have the Army nurses they needed.
I'm guessing it's a jump in pay too, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it was. Yeah, I didn't realize what I'd been given and what I had, besides a free education and all the pay I received the whole time. I never took it for granted, but I really didn't understand the gift I'd been given and gotten in on. So then graduated the 5th of June, commissioned the 6th of June, and basically were free but had orders to go down to Fort Sam Houston for officer basic training.
Did any family come out for a ceremony?
My parents.
Okay. What do they think? What do they think of you doing this?
And my younger sister.
They must have been pretty proud, huh?
Very, and in fact, my last name Sunsdahl, S-U, I was sitting next to Diane Stillwell, S-T, and my dad just about dropped his teeth when he's looking at the commencement list of graduates and sees the name Stillwell, because Vinegar Joe Stillwell was an admiral in World War II, and my dad was a Pacific World War II theater. And it turns out it wasn't Vinegar Joe Stillwell, it was a relative that was a general in the Army, but when he saw Stillwell, he thought I was sitting next to General Stillwell's daughter, Admiral Stillwell's daughter, and her father was a general in his own right. But so that was the first big woohoo. We did a lot of sightseeing, went to the National Cemetery, Monticello, George Washington's home. And then from there, Mom and Dad and my younger sister Donna did a tour of some Civil War fields, like up in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg in particular. And I drove home from there, and Mom and Dad and my sister Donna did some other sightseeing and stuff. So I drove back to Minnesota, and then my next responsibility was to be at Fort Sam Houston. It was the middle of August, I'm not sure of the date, for basically officer training. I remember a lot of marching in the rain, and we marched in the rain, and we marched in the rain, a lot of class work, and then 2 weeks at Camp Bullis.
Well, with Fort Sam Houston, how long were you in training?
So that was 6 weeks, and included in that 6 weeks was 2 weeks at this Camp Bullis, which was an outdoor barracks, and we shot rifles and did the gas mask thing.
So you're doing basic training.
And did a whole lot more marching in the rain. And I did get those black Army boots were broken in very nicely by the end of being at Camp Bullis. And I actually wore those Army boots in later years just for muck work around. They were comfortable, and they became work boots, and they were anyway. So that, and then immediately upon completion of that basic training, we went to our duty stations. And I had orders for Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in Denver. And that was another medical center. So basically, I went from Walter Reed Army Medical Center to Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center. So my nursing career in the Army was around a huge hospital setting, teaching institution. I was never stationed at a smaller hospital or overseas, but I had hoped when I went into the program that I would be stationed overseas. I really wanted to go to Europe, but I didn't care where I went. I was ready to go and wanted to, and that didn't happen. So anyway, I was stationed in Denver, and the only commitment after this whole nursing program that was paid for me was 3 years. But I extended another year, so I was at Fitzsimmons in Denver for 4 years. My career, I achieved
rank in Denver for 4 years?
Yep, I achieved the rank of captain. One of the deciding factors in me getting out of the Army was that with time and grade, you can't stay static in the Army. You have to achieve farther rank, and unfortunately for me, farther rank means you go into more administrative roles. And I really liked bedside nursing. I wanted to stay with bedside nursing, but I was offered the chance to go on to school in order then to qualify as a major, because I met criteria for that. And it was the wrong time in my life to say I'm going to go on to school and do this. I was a mother by then. I just didn't see how going away to school when I was a mother was going to work.
I was going to ask you, did you do any dating or anything?
So it was the wrong time in my life to stay in the Army, push on and go to school, and enhance my military career. And I left with reluctance, but I ETS'd or got out of the Army in Denver. So that was the end of that military career. So
what year is this?
1980. August of 1980 is when I ETS'd.
So you're at 72 to 80.
Active duty. And moved to the Seattle area for about a year and a half. Then moved back to Stephen for about a year and a half. And while I lived in Stephen as a single parent with my parents, I started drilling with a reserve unit in Grand Forks that was a clearing company. And so for 6 months, I went to Grand Forks once a month.
What's the clearing company? A
clearing company is front line. It's where the wounded soldiers are brought for triage and initial treatment before they're then transferred to a MASH unit. So there are no nurses on the front lines. They're all in the MASH units. And so the commanding officer said, well, we don't have any real medical openings right now, but for a captain, the opening I have is to be in charge of the mess hall. I said, okay, well, I went home and told my dad that, and he laughed. He thought that was going to be so funny. I thought, okay, well, I guess, I'll do what I got to do. And I went back the next month, and he goes, guess what? Our medical training officer just moved away. So I'm going to put you in the medical training officer slot. I was so relieved.
Because this is a medical unit.
Yeah. So I was in charge of medical training for that unit for 6 months. And then from there, I moved to Colorado Springs. I got in touch with some old friends from my Denver days, found about a nursing position that I was really interested in, and it was time to move on. And
are you done with reserves now? Or?
So when I left the Minnesota area and moved to Colorado Springs, that was the end of my military career completely, because as a single parent, I knew that I couldn't have the responsibility of what to do with the kids if I were called to active duty.
And what year is this?
So that would have been 1983
83. Okay.
that I moved to Colorado Springs in March of 1983. Yeah.
So what rank were you when you...
Captain, but what was hanging out there was I was on the list to be a major. And in fact, I saw that in the Army Times. I have that copy of the Army Times, that people that have made rank and time and grade next in line to be majors. And my name is on that list, but I never pursued it.
Do officers, do they take any kind of tests to advance or?
Well, there is Advanced Officer Training, AOT. And so when I was company grade officer, lieutenant and captain, the answer to that is no. What else I would have been required to switch to field grade officer, which would be major and the colonels, there may be, but I don't know because I didn't pursue it.
Do you take go in and do some kind of interview to get promoted or?
Not to go from lieutenant to captain.
Because NCOs, my daughter's in the Navy, NCOs, until they're chiefs, they have to take tests, and after that, they just go in and interview, see what they know.
It was, I'm sure, based on performance evaluations that happened routinely, and for a stretch of time when I was at Fitzsimmons, I was the ranking captain, so I was responsible for the performance evaluations of the NCOs in my clinic area. And they made sure I knew the right words to use, like outstanding is a better word to use than excellent. And I was really close to these guys, and I know they liked me. I worked in dialysis, which is a highly technical area of training and expertise, and they gave me my own little potentiometer, which is a little screwdriver. They trusted me enough to get into the guts of the machine when they needed tweaking and stuff, and they didn't do that with everybody, so I had a good working relationship with those guys. And one summer I was detailed down in the emergency room, spent the summer in the emergency room because the officer there was going to be gone, and I missed out on a Sunsdahl family reunion. I was so upset about that, but they said, this is where you're going to be this summer, and that's what I did. Yeah. From my hometown, while I lived in the Denver area, Alan Nelson was stationed in the Air Force there. Alan Nelson from Stephen, Minnesota, married to Mary Rasmussen, also Stephen people. And I remember one night I was working in the ER. Mary brought their daughter in for some reason. It was just kind of interesting to run into somebody like that in the emergency room at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver.
I'm going to take it back here a little bit, Mary. Now, when you were in reserves, did you go to summer camp at all? Did you have to go to summer camp?
No, because I moved. I would have. There would have been. That would have been, but I moved in March, and usually those things were arranged in the summer, and other units from other states would all meet in one big area, and they do a big exercise.
Okay.
So I missed out on that.
You were lucky. Kind of.
In retrospect, I'm sure it would have been a good story.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I missed out on that.
Okay. Kind of threw you off track there.
Yeah.
So, looking back on your military career, I've asked this question to everybody. Would you have done anything different?
How could I have gotten more out of it? It was good. I got in on a really great program. I learned that we had our 40th nursing reunion in San Antonio in 2016. And I learned that the Army Nurse Corps does not recognize RAIN, W-R-A-I-N, because we had it so cush and we weren't real. And so Rain graduates, the program existed from 1968 to 1978, have had to kind of create their own.
Who came up with "You're Not Real"?
The Army Nurse Corps, I don't want to say it was jealousy, but we were handed everything. We were told where to go, what to do, given an education, receive pay, and for whatever reason, several of the Army Nurse Corps will not have us in their museum represented. So older classes have put together trying to be a picture and a voice, like at the Army Nurse Memorial in Washington, D.C., making sure they were out there with signs and just recognizing that, yeah, we were given a lot.
You were given a lot,
but that doesn't mean we didn't appreciate it and didn't give our all for the Army Nurse Corps.
But you were still military.
Yes, yeah.
You held the rank, the pay, everything goes with it.
Right, and one of the other big pluses for me that I realize how lucky I am, I was an E3 my whole 4 years of college. Summer between my junior and senior year, I used that status and I got on a military hop. I drove out to March Air Force Base with a classmate. We got on a military hop.
What's that mean, military hop?
Military flight in a C-130, this big old jet where you got your feet on top of some kind of missile or something while you're flying across the ocean. And we got to Guam, and we stayed at Guam a day and a half before we could get another flight out, and we went to Thailand. And we just started flying around because we could get on these flights. And there was this colonel and his son ahead of us. Everywhere we went, it seemed like, and he kept bumping us. So we thought we had a seat on a flight. No, now you're bumped. So then we'd have to hang around the airport a little longer.
So you're just touring, is what you're doing?
Yeah, and spending money and time. So we went from actually to Hawaii first, Hickam Field and the barracks there on the beach, and then Schofield Barracks, and then to Anderson Field in Guam, and then to Thailand, and we flew into Karat Air Force Base. And I think Alan Nelson was stationed up at Udon or Ubon in northern Thailand at the time. I know he was in Thailand at the same time. And that's where we spent the bulk of our time. We had this money, and we landed at Karat Air Force Base, took the bus to Bangkok, spent some time in Bangkok, and then took a bus to Utapao, another air base, and spent time and money there. And from there we wanted to go to Japan. But some guys came up to us and said, things are really heating up in Cambodia, and if you could get out, you better go.
What year was that?
That would have been 75.
Yeah.
So, summer of 75. So, I remember driving by Camp Samisan and, on the bus and seeing elephants in the fields, and it was really a great experience, and I appreciated it.
Are you traveling around in civilian clothes now, or do you have
Yep.
a uniform?
Yep.
All civilian clothes?
Yeah.
Okay.
With our E3 cards. And then, so the flight we got out went to Norton Air Force Base in California. So we never got to Japan. And I wanted to go to Japan because I had a classmate, Maureen Rood, was in the Army. After LPN school, she went into the Army, and her husband actually was Air Force, and he ended up being stationed in Japan. Anyway, going to Japan never happened for me. Went back to Norton Air Force Base. Had a little more money and time, spent a few weeks at Norton Air Force Base. And then I kind of hitchhiked my way home. There was this other guy who was going home to Ohio. And I said, well, can I have a ride? Can you drop me off in Des Moines? So I got a ride to Des Moines and flew up to Grand Forks, and I went home for the rest of the summer, and then got a car and drove out then to Washington, D.C. for my senior year. So I had a real fortunate, I was fortuitous, I guess is the right word. I was in the right place at the right time. And I was given a real gift. The Army was good to me.
Well, somebody had some smarts there too, I believe.
Well, I made the grade. But you know, I was not top in my class at all. But I was a good enough student, and I worked hard, and I really believe that Jim Shinley, our superintendent, probably gave me a really glowing reference, because I was a hard worker, always a hard worker, never a slacker. Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about your military career, Mary?
Not without looking at my crib sheet here, which might take a few minutes. I made a lot of notes. I think I got it pretty well covered. I might have jumped around some. My brother going in to the Army and being at Fort Leonard Wood, we would write letters back and forth. I was in Minneapolis at the time, and we've been recently talking about some letters that he wrote to me and that I wrote back to him about his time down there. So came from a military family and was glad to continue that.
Okay, Mary. Anything else?
Not that I can think of. If I have a real important addendum, I'll let you know.
Thank you. Mary, I want to thank you for doing this interview, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Keith.